good day to you. My name is Jim Mellon. I'm one of the co-founders of the Longevity Forum. And it's my great pleasure and delight to introduce my friend, Father Michael Collins, who's going to be starting today a new series for the Longevity Forum, fusing art, antiquity, and the search for the elixir of youth, or the search for longevity that's gone on for thousands of years. As you know, the Longevity Forum is now in its 4th year, and this year we're planning to do some great stuff in November, and leading up to that, Father Michael, among others, is going to be producing a series of relevant webinars for us. I can tell you that Michael is a noted art historian, noted theologian, has taught at multiple universities, and has become a good friend. I met him with my sister Trish at the canonization of Henry Newman when I was part of the Oriel College Oxford delegation to the Vatican. And Michael gave us a wonderful tour, a bespoke tour actually, of the Vatican treasures while we were there. And that will be a day that I will never forget. And it's with great pleasure I'm going to introduce you all to Michael, who in a second will say a few words and then start his presentation. But before I do that, Michael is a really good speaker. He manages to make complicated topics interesting and accessible to anyone in the audience. And may I urge you to tell your friends, family, everyone, including the Pope, if you know him, that they should be tuning in to the next one of Michael's presentations, which will occur in a few weeks' time. So with that, over to you, Michael, and thank you so much on behalf of the Longevity Forum for agreeing to do this wonderful series.
Thank you, Jim. I'm delighted to be part of our series, in fact, and it was Defina and yours idea to come up with this concept of extending our knowledge of longevity, because longevity is not merely measured in the amount of years that we're given, but in what we do with those years. So rather than look to the future, which is the very definition of longevity, what we've decided to do is go back into the past and to look at some of the people in the past, their way of approaching life and death. And at the end of our short presentation, which will be illustrated in a few moments, I'll be very happy to answer some questions and answers if you have any. Thank you. For thousands of years, Egypt has been one of the most fascinating places on the face of the earth. We readily recognize the image of pharaohs and pyramids, obelisks which marked the boundaries of the cities, hieroglyphics and hieroglyphics which depict in a series of human and animal images the history of the people who inhabited the north of Africa 5,000 years ago. The old adage, location, 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 is particularly apt in the case of Egypt. The key to its success lies in the geography of the area. The River Nile, which rises in Burundi, runs northwards 6,650 kilometers through Africa before flowing into the Mediterranean Sea. Traditionally, it was believed to have been the longest river in the world, although it is marginally beaten by the Amazon River in South America. Thousands of years ago, Egypt was covered by a far denser vegetation than today. Hunting and grazing was relatively easy, and the plentiful supply of water from the Nile allowed simple irrigation through a myriad of canals. The seasonal flooding of the Nile made the delta a fertile area where crops grew plentifully in the silt. Thanks to the artists who have depicted images over the thousands of years, we're able to see a little glimpse of how people lived several millennia ago. The north of Egypt lay across the southern border of the Mediterranean Sea, providing a vital source of food and access to the trade routes which covered the Mediterranean basin. By 5500, we have evidence of tribes gathering together to form large communities in the north of Africa. These allowed members trade with each other, offered protection and defense from outdoors, and permitted the development of language, writing, art, and architecture. As in all societies, leaders rose to rule the lands, and in Egypt, over a period of 3,000 years, 30 dynasties of pharaohs ruled from around 3000 to 30 BC, before the Christian era. Around these rulers, which saw its lifeline as the Nile River, grew up a bureaucracy which governed trade with neighboring countries, organized armies for conquest and defense. The earliest site of rule or capital was Memphis on the west bank of the Nile in Upper Egypt. Today, the ruins lie about 20 kilometers south of Cairo. For generations, Memphis was the entire center of administration until it was eventually overtaken by Thebes, which lay today near the city of Luxor, further south along the Nile. It was hailed by Homer as glistening with gold and surrounded by 100 gates. It was inhabited from around 3200 BC, and from here the pharaohs sought to unite the various provinces of Egypt, north and south, defend its borders, and make occasional incursions into the land of its neighbors. Thebes declined in the 13th century BC as government moved northward to the Delta region. But this overview is simply to help us understand what Egypt was and how it became one of the greatest civilizations, if not the greatest civilization of antiquity. Even when Egypt came under the control of the Assyrians between 653 BC to 332 BC, and then under the Ptolemaic rulers between 332 and 30 BC, when it became a Roman province, it continued to develop a unique art and architecture. The key to understanding the success of Egypt, of ancient Egypt, lies in the fan-shaped delta where the Nile emptied into the Mediterranean. Because this area flooded, vegetation was not enormous. Even today, much of Egypt is covered by sand. But this vegetation allowed the growth of vegetables, of grains, allowed plentiful fish to be caught to feed the population. And it also provided a very important means of transmitting the civilization of the Egyptians. So the Nile served as a waterway, a highway, a concourse where trade could be conducted. People generally lived by the banks of the Nile, and that meant that the pharaohs, over 3,000 years, as they passed upwards and downwards, north and south along the river, they were able to greet the people who lived there. But one of the most important products was papyrus, a plant which grows in the damp area of the delta. And this papyrus formed the possibility and gave the Egyptians the possibility of recording their history. And by cutting the stalk and slicing the stalk, these could be wet and laid perpendicularly across each other, so they would eventually form what we now would recognize, for anybody interested in the ancient world, as papyrus. And this is a fairly flat sheet where people would be able to write and record. So papyrus was important in the history of ancient Egypt. The papyrus did two things. It allowed the people of the area between Greece, between Egypt, between the north of Africa, to record their beliefs, record their history, record their myths, etc. But also, the papyrus was a light enough and yet watertight vegetation which allowed them make boats. And these images, which have been taken from the tombs of the ancient Egyptians up to 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, show us what life was seen to be like in those days. Because for us, it's impossible to have photographs, to have images This is something we're so used now to visual and digital technology that we're able to communicate within seconds with each other across the globe. There's no delay. But the world in which we are living and visiting is a very different world, because these people lived a much more simple life, very close to the land. They depended on the water for their fish and for their travel. They depended on the small amount of wood, which was a very precious material, probably as precious as the ores that we have today. They valued wood enormously, and it was only used sparingly because it was rather expensive. But it was a wonderful medium whereby everybody was able to carve and to record and to show and to keep how they saw each other. And as we're interested in longevity, we can look back at these people. And it's sobering to keep in mind that archaeologists have worked out that the majority of people lived between 25 to 30 years. That was the mean average. Infant mortality was enormous. Again, we're dealing in an era when there was no antibiotics. Medicine was very, very different from what it is now. Cures were very, very difficult to effect. Operations usually ended with the death of the patient. So as we look at these images, which date 4,000 years back in history, we see the way people lived, how they comported themselves, how they lived their lives. We can tell so much of their diet. We can do bone density tests today. So we know what height they were, we know their weight, we know so many things about them, we know their genetics. And we know indeed that the early Egyptians came from a combination of Southern Africans and people from the area of Syria. And these fused. And when we talk about 3,000 years of pharaonic rule in 30 dynasties, these were not handed down one generation to the next as hereditary monarchies. These were often grabbed by invaders who took the title of ruler, who took the title of pharaoh, who united the kingdom north and south, and united it with a series of laws. We have the famous Code of Hammurabi, which dates from around this period in modern day Iran, Iraq, Mesopotamia. And that is a series of laws which lays out how commerce was regulated and how life was lived. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So when we see these people, when we look at them, we see people who show us what life was like in the past. But they show us very much what life was like also in the present. For the purpose of our meeting today, let's look at a fascinating book of the dead, because it's by examining the tombs and the monuments of those who have died thousands of years ago that we are able to understand today how they lived. There is a book called The Book of the Dead, but in actual fact, it's a misnomer, because The Book of the Dead is a title conjured up in the 1820s by German scholars who studied the writings mostly in hieroglyphic form, which painstakingly explained the expectation and the hopes which Egyptians had of the afterlife. When somebody died, at the very beginning of the process, we're talking about the pharaohs, the rulers, the landowners, the most important people within society. The body was taken and over a period of 70 days was mummified. The first thing that the embalmer did when they approached the body was to remove the brain through the nasal passage, to tear out the brain, because it was one of the soft tissues which would disintegrate, and all the other internal body organs of the stomach and of the chest were removed, save but the heart. The body then was covered with salts, a dry natron salt, and then it was put in a bath of salt for a number of days so that the skin would dry out. And then the embalmer wrapped the body in thin linen strips, linen which grew so, cotton which grew so abundantly in the area of the Nile. This was all carried out by the priests of the cemeteries which were nearby to the tombs where people lived and where people were buried. And then there was a set of formulas and set of spells and set of blessings which were given so that the person would be able to carry on into the new world and into their new life. The 70 days of preparation concluded with the emplacement of the body into the mummy's coffin. Often there were 3 coffins, but very often for people who were not very wealthy, they had to settle for 1 coffin made of wood. And again, I mentioned that wood was an expensive item. So the majority of Egyptians, when they were buried, were simply wrapped in linen or perhaps in rushes, a mat made out of rushes, and that's how they were buried. The body itself was covered with amulets, and these were charms which were to help the person enter into the afterlife. And finally, Anubis, the god of the afterlife, would explain to the people when they had died how they were going to enter into eternal life, into eternity, which would be the reward of the life which they had lived in this world. The body, once it had been placed in the coffin, was taken then to the place of burial, covered with incense to mask probably the smell of decomposition. And all furniture which had belonged to the deceased, or even furniture which was purchased after the death of the deceased, was placed in the tomb. And the walls of the tomb were decorated with hieroglyphics, with paintings, all of which helped the people record the events of their life. In the 19th century, archaeologists began to uncover extraordinary amounts of papyrus and documents, and to open ancient tombs, many of which had not been opened for hundreds upon hundreds, if not thousands of years. And inside, they would have expected to find a treasure trove, but indeed, very often thieves had got there from antiquity before them and had rifled and emptied the tombs. But what they have preserved are these books of the dead, these long scrolls of papyrus, decorated papyrus, which over the centuries were used and preserved in the tombs from around the mid-15th century right up of the Christian period, prior to the Christian period. So we'll say about 1450 BC up to about 430 AD. So that period of around 1,000 years. So these books of the dead, these scrolls, these incantations, these imprecations of the gods and goddesses to allow the soul to enter into eternity, the Ba, the Ka, that place of the intellect, of the memory, of the mind, of the personality, that part which was eternal, represented by the heart, that was allowed to carry on into eternity. Here we have a book called the Book of Ani, which dates from around 1280 BC. On our left-hand side, we see Ani. He was a scribe of Thebes. He's making a prayer and an incantation to Osiris and the god of the underworld. He's accompanied by his wife, who's holding a musical instrument, which indicates that she is in mourning. And indeed, both are dressed in white. White was the color of mourning in Africa at that time. And around the text, we have the hieroglyphics, which are red, and they begin by saying, "O great God, God of the two lands, I come to you, open your ears, allow the meat sacrifices which I bring to you be satisfactory in your sight." In another portion of this scroll, which measures 78 feet, this long papyrus scroll, which was wrapped up and then placed in the coffin with the body of the deceased. In the upper register, we find the procession to the tomb. At the very center, we'll find the body of Ani. On the left-hand side, we'll find the family and the servants and the friends in mourning, and they are making their journey and they are crying. And it's interesting to note that the Egyptians always showed their figures in a side profile because they weren't able to depict them in a more naturalistic manner. And that's why we always find them with a foot forward, even though it doesn't make any sense. And both hands are usually shown palms forward. And they always show their eyes rather large, and that's because they weren't able to foreshorten them the way that an artist today would have noticed. So the body is brought on its bier, accompanied by the weeping wife, the weeping widow, who's waiting for the moment when the body is placed in the tomb. And if you notice, it's been carried on a boat, and we cannot be sure whether it's been transported along the Nile, which is quite possible, or whether this was a ceremonial boat, a way in which the dead were accompanied to their eternal life and everlasting place of rest. And here we have the slaves or the undertakers who are bringing the large coffin. It's obviously quite a heavy coffin, and they're leading the procession, and animals, probably pack animals, are pulling the procession forward. And you notice also one of the figures is wearing a leopard skin, and again reminds us so closely that the ancients lived cheek by jowl with their animals, some of which were domesticated, such as cats and dogs, and some of which were kept for work, such as elephants, such as mules, donkeys, horses, etc. So here we have probably the most famous of all the 78 feet of this great book, this great scroll. And Annie has come into the Hall of Judgment. Curiously, Annie did not know that this was going to be a script. This wasn't made for him. This was one which was probably produced by the people of the area around the undertaker's industry. And scribes were given this job. Remember, literacy was very, very low. Less than 1% were able to read or write in ancient Egypt. So the people had these pieces of paper which were inscribed with their deeds and with their lives. But these were very often prepared, and then just the name of the deceased was added in by a priest once they knew that the person had died. Once more, Annie and his wife come into the Hall of Judgment. Above them are a series of gods, 42 gods and goddesses, who are given the position of standing in judgment along with Horus to see that this person enters into eternity. Ani is represented in his soul, and the soul is divided into the Ba and the Ka, which represents the memory, the intellect, the personality, the will of the person. So it's not just something which is going to be eternal, but it gathers everything which was essential to the person as they lived. And that's why this bird-like figure with the human head represents that Ba, that Ka, that part which is going to fly into eternity. And the text of the ancient Book of the Dead was really translated in proper Egyptian as the book of the opening up into eternal life, or the book of the leaving of darkness, so that they would receive their reward. In the Hall of Judgment, Ani must give his heart, and it's the only organ which is left in his body. It's the only part which has not been removed by the undertakers as they prepared the mummy during that 70 days. The heart remains in his body, and the heart is going to represent for him his Ba, his Ka, his soul, that immortal part of him. He then has to have his heart weighed, and the various figures who stand around are going to judge and see as Anubis weighs up a feather, and this is an ostrich feather, and Anubis holds the plum and tries to work out, is the heart worthy to move forward? Because if not, if the heart is found to have committed anything negative, any sin, any offense, even though there's no forgiveness, the heart is going to be destroyed and devoured by the goddess Mat, who stands here or sits crouching with the mouth of a crocodile, with the body of a leopard, and with the rear part of a hippopotamus, waiting to devour the soul, waiting to devour the heart, that essence of Ani. So this is a very important part. And Ani will say, "Oh, my heart, do not let me down. Do not tell lies upon me." And Ani is obliged to say a number of things. "I have never polluted the sacred waters of the river, that is, of the Nile. I have never told untruths. I have never listened to a conversation which was not part of my conversation. I have not taken things which were mine." So they're all given in the negative. He doesn't say, "I did this, I did that, I was charitable, I was kind, I was generous, I was good, I was..." No, that's not the way the Egyptians approached eternal life. They approached life by ticking off all the things which they hadn't done. So it's a negative bill of health, if you like, so that they can move forwards. And now we find Ani at the end has in fact arrived in his eternal reward. So we're surrounded by an idealization of the river. Again, once more, this is the River Nile. And he's doing all the things that he wanted to do in life, but he wants now to do for eternity. So he's quite happy to cut the grain. He's quite happy to bring his cows to pasture. He's quite happy to till the land with a pack animal. All of this makes him happy. And his fecundity, his contentment is represented by the cows at the far right-hand side and the bull, because these are the venerable, the valuable animals of antiquity in Egypt. A similar explanation comes in the book of Hunnefer, the Book of the Dead. Also, he lived around the same time as Ani, and Hunnefer was a priest in Thebes. And we know that he, in fact, was very much involved in the particular preparation of his own Book of the Dead. And once more, we find him being led in by Anubis, who holds the amulet of life and of truth. And he walks into the hall. The gods once more are seated above. They're overlooking this whole event, and they're going to be part of the judges, these judgment gods. And once more, Anubis prepares the scale. The heart is on the left-hand side in the scale. That has to be weighed up against the ostrich feather, and the goddess Maat is waiting so that she can devour, if she's lucky enough to get her meal, of Hufet's heart. He passes over, and the god Thoth stands to his left-hand side, and he's holding in his outstretched hand a piece of papyrus or with a stylus, so that he can record the deeds, the negative deeds of Hufer. He has not done this, he has not done that, he has not done all the other things which would be offensive to bar him entering into eternal life. And therefore he's ushered forward into the presence of Osiris, who now is going to grant him his desire. Behind him is Isis, his wife, and her sister, and in front of him are 4 little statuettes who represent the god Horus's, the sons of Horus. So we have this moment of judgment. The goddess Maat has not got what she wanted. She looks probably in disbelief as the deceased is recorded as having achieved what was necessary to enter into eternal life. And then the judgment is given, is passed, and he is now able to enter eternal life. Of all the great finds of the ancient world, probably the most important took place in 1922, when the English archaeologist Howard Carter entered into a tomb, the tomb of Tutankhamun, which had been closed for over 2,500 years. Tutankhamun died in the 13th century. He was probably about 18 or 19. He came to power when his father Akhenaten died. Akhenaten was the pharaoh who worshipped the god, the sun, Aten, the god of the sun. And the young pharaoh, Tutankhamun, took over from his father and was too young really to rule. So therefore, he was governed by a regent. But nevertheless, over the 9 or 10 years of his reign, he amassed a certain amount of wealth. He was a warring pharaoh. We know that he was involved in battles, and indeed, battle was one of the staple diets of Egypt in that time. They were always doing battle with their neighbors, either keeping their neighbors away or trying to amalgamate with their neighbors and arrange for truces. And indeed, it's possible that Tutankhamun died as a result of a chariot accident, which may have taken place either in preparations for war or during the war itself. But nevertheless, his monument was filled. It was a small monument. It wasn't the tomb which would normally be prepared for a pharaoh. You'd imagine something would be far greater. But nevertheless, they were able to pack his tomb with important items: gold, gilt gold, solid gold, jewels, enamels. All of these, up to 5,000 separate objects, were laid in the tomb. The golden toe caps to cover his toes and fingers, the great sarcophagus made of gold, which was his final resting place, covered with 3 doors. And all around this were food offerings as well, so that he would be able to eat his way in eternity and never have to rely on anybody else. His sandals were essential for walking into judgment and eternal life. His canopic jars, which held his eternal organs, accompanied his body. And his golden sandals, which brought him into new life, were also laid close by his mummy. And his body was buried in 3 coffins, probably not the coffins which were identified for him, because he died unexpectedly, as I say, at the age of 18 or 19. And certainly one of the masks which covered his face was not for him. This is the mask of a female, so it was not prepared for him. And the ceremonial beard was attached, even though in real life the pharaohs wore an artificial ceremonial garlanded beard. Nevertheless, this wasn't what was supposed to go on the face of Tutankhamun, the boy king. But he continues to look out at us, and he continues to challenge us in our understanding of how the world has developed. And it's interesting from the point of view, the search for eternity, especially for people who lived probably 25 to 30 years of age, and after that they died. That search was so important for them. It was fundamental because they did not see life as ending simply with the span which they've been allocated. Today, if we say somebody dies at 30, we regard them as extremely young. But here we have a snapshot. We're able to look into the past over 3,000 years, and we're able to see the expressions, the joys, the hopes, the confidence, the fears that these people had, which are probably identical to the hopes, joys, and fears which we have today. And the artists have managed to interpret the mind of these people. And as they portray the body, curiously, even though this young man is clearly a little over a teenager, nevertheless, he's represented as a man of power and of authority. His role is recognized as the spiritual and as the civic ruler of Egypt. And the people venerated him for that reason. The history of Egypt was very much one of war and battle, of containment, of conquest. But ultimately, what people wanted was peace and tranquility. And that's reflected in the way they treated their dead, as they placed amulets of eternal hope on their body to ward off evil spirits, to ward off tomb raiders, so that as they painted the walls of their monuments, as they decorated the inside of their coffins, they would remember what they had achieved in life. They would be proud of the things which they had not done, those evil, wrong deeds which would have brought dishonor to their name and memory, so that they could live on in an eternal life, in eternal happiness.
All right, what an excellent presentation, Father Michael. Thank you so much. Now, I think we have a little time for some questions from the chat room. Let's see. So, our first question, do we know much about the inspiration of Egyptian rituals around death? Did they emerge from previous rituals and become more elaborate, or did they develop very distinctively?
Well, that's an excellent question. It's a very difficult one, in fact, to answer. It's almost like a trick question. But I think it would be fair to say that every civilization, every culture has a means of disposing of the dead. Because when people die, they have to be buried, they have to be cremated, they have to be placed in some way away from the living. And that's even from, I suppose, the point of view, a hygienic question. And later on, when we come to look at the Greeks and the Romans in our later webinars, we'll be looking at that very same question. So I would imagine that the early Egyptians developed their processes over the centuries. But as you can see, almost every society has continued to retain and develop its burial practices.
Excellent. Now, on demographics at the time, what percentage of the population were in slavery versus non-slavery?
Well, again, that's a very, very interesting question. The majority of people were, I would say, in indemnity. They were working for other people. The basic lifestyle was very low, if you term it in today's, if we try and look at it today. Most people, as I said, lived towards the riverbank because that was the source of water. All the villages and indeed the cities were built at that area. So we would say that it was very much a pyramid. There were the wealthy aristocrats, the landowners, the property holders at the top of the pyramid. And then as you came down, you the lower classes, if we want to use that term, and these were people who really made the whole society tick. So I would say, maybe I wouldn't use the word slavery and masters in the sense, but certainly it was an economic question.
Very interesting. Now, let's see, what year was Ami living on Earth?
Around 1250. His dates are between 1250 and 1280 BC. That's just over it's over 3,000 years ago.
Okay, great. And last question, was there a range in lifespans in ancient Egypt? Many pharaohs seem to pass away at such a young age, like Tutankhamun. So was there a range between the people that lived, say, in service, like you mentioned, indemnity, versus royalty?
Well, I think you could say that it's exactly the way today, that the rich live longer and the poor die younger. I suppose that's probably the easiest way of saying it. And that is all connected with the work which they had to do, the access to medicines and healthcare, etc. So there was a range, but I was struck when I was doing my research to see that the average lifespan was about 30 years of age. So people lived a little bit shorter. Infant mortality was very, very high. If you didn't die within your first year, you probably died within your first 5 years. And then if you were lucky to make it onwards, you may have been able to get to the threshold of 30. But it would be rare to find older people. We do know the regent for Tutankhamun was 60. So when Tutankhamun came to the throne, the man who was looking after Egypt in his place was already 60. So that just shows there was quite a spread of ages.
Oh. And did all the pharaohs get buried in the pyramids?
No, in actual fact, the pyramids died out. They were only in use for probably only a couple of hundred years, but they resisted, if you like. They were such sturdy buildings. They've stayed on and they've become monuments. But then the majority of the pharaohs, the men and the women rulers, were buried in the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens, and in other places, which indeed I would say probably have not yet been located. But I would make a point that in archaeological terms, over the last 10, 20, 30 years, there have been extraordinary finds, and almost every month, every 2 months. When you look at Egyptian archaeology, you'll find that more tombs have been discovered and excavated, etc. So it's quite an industry.
Great. And a comment on that the regent was 60 before King Tut. What do we know about elders in Egyptian society?
Well, again, I make the point that the majority of people didn't really get much over the age of 30 to 40. So we're used, especially talking about longevity, which is our focus, we're used to talking about people who are older in their 80s or 90s. But keep in mind, until a couple of 100 years ago, also our average age was around 40. So therefore, we're pushing the boundaries. And I believe that in today's world, I'm not quite sure of my facts, but certainly out of every 4 or 5 children who are born, 2 or 3 of them are going to see 100 for sure. So we'll continue pushing that forward, and I imagine that will go to the next few centuries.
And were elders at that time, were they valued more in society because there were so few of them?
No, I don't think you could say that. I think it was a very different society. So we've got to leave to one side the way that we look at older people today. It was very much a survival of the fittest because it was a vast society. I'm not sure exactly what the population was over this span of 3,000 years, but the majority of people, as I say, were poorer people. And as I mentioned, literacy was less than 1%. So literacy is a key to education, which is a key to advancement, etc. So therefore, you can imagine that older people may not have been regarded with any great extra care.
And were there any superstitions around longevity?
Oh, that's a very good question. In fact, I'll have to think that one out and go and do a little bit of research and maybe come back on our next meeting.
Okay, well, I have one last question that'll end this, and it's what caused the end of the pharaohs?
Well, it was, I suppose you could say Julius Caesar, because Egypt was taken over as a Roman province, and you remember the battle with Mark Antony, Julius Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, etc. It was at that time, and then Cleopatra was at the very end of the dynasty of the pharaohs. So Egypt, for all its greatness, it also crumbled and fell into a larger conglomerate, which was the Roman Empire. And we'll be meeting the Roman Empire in the webinar after next.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that webinar. And keep in mind, this is a series, everyone, and the next webinar will be on Monday, 12 April at 5 p.m. London time. And it is going to be on the search for perfection in ancient Greece. And I'm really looking forward to that, Father Michael. Thank you so much today for this lovely presentation.
Oh, great pleasure. Thank you.